All right, we want to look today at Nimrod, the Tower of Babel, and the confusion of language. Now, it's not always seen immediately as you're reading through Genesis 10 and 11 how Nimrod and the Tower of Babel are connected, but I think we'll be able to show that. The passage that we're going to be dealing with, and let me take you there, Genesis 10, 6 to 12. And the sons of Ham. You remember Ham, Shem, Japheth were the three sons of Noah. The sons of Ham, and he lists them as Cush, this is our word for Ethiopia, Mizraim, the word for that came to mean Egypt, or the Egypts, Phut and Canaan. I forget Phut was. Anybody remember? There was one. It's another land. I forgot. But in Canaan, of course. And the sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, and Ramah, and Sabteka. Then he goes back to Ramah. The sons of Ramah were Sheba and Dedan, which he'll develop later. Now it says, and Cush begat Nimrod. You'll see that Nimrod is not listed as one of the sons. I've noticed that most of the commentators immediately say, well, must have been the youngest son, maybe the youngest by far, or something like that. It doesn't say that he was his son. They were clearly listed here. So I take this to be from the line of Cush came Nimrod. And Nimrod began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as, it's a parable, even as, or a comparison, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. So that was what he was called, mighty hunter. And the beginning of his kingdom, just the beginning, was Babel. Babel would later be the heart of Babylon, Babylonia. And then Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Shinar is a plain, and that's where Babylonia was. It's in Mesopotamia, between the rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates. Out of that land went forth Ashur. And I think that most of the commentators that I checked actually went with the alternate reading, the King James margin has, he went out into Assyria. Ashur being a name, Assyria named for Ashur, but this would mean that Nimrod, having settled these other areas, then went forth into Assyria, what would become Syria, and builded Nineveh, then the city Rehoboth. This word Rehoboth means the streets of, so it could mean builded Nineveh and the streets of the city. And I think that makes more sense. And besides Nineveh, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, the same is a great city. So several of these, many of these, they have been discovered archaeologically. And so we'll be looking at a map in a bit. Let me just say that Arthur Pink calls this story the cause from the human side, which led up to God abandoning his dealings with the nations and singling out Abram to be the father of his chosen people, Israel. What he's saying is that we see the decline of people interested in following the Lord generally across the nations. And God then decides to choose one man to build a nation from him. Let's look first of all then at Nimrod. My title gave you my 3 points: Nimrod, Tower of Babel, confusion of the language. Nimrod, I just found that so many fables and exaggerations swirl around him. Every little thing that they can find, like his name, could mean revolt or rebel. And so immediately they assume that he's this terrible bad guy, and that he's named to be a revolt against God or something. And some people read back that Ham's son Canaan was cursed, you remember? And so here he's revolting against God, cursing his family line. None of this is in the Bible. So we're going to find that he seems to be the head of something that God takes a stand against. That's as far as we can go. However, we see in this his lineage from Cush, Genesis 10:8a, and Cush begat Nimrod. So in my thinking, the wording suggests that Nimrod was in the line of Cush, but not one of his sons. They are listed as Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, and Sabteca. Then it goes back and it actually names the son of Rama. So I think we might assume that Nimrod came through the line of one of the other sons, but it's not mentioned. From Cush, it jumps to Nimrod as the most famous descendant that they could list. This was a big guy. This was a major guy. I went through and looked for images, and nobody had I wanted him with a bow and arrow as a hunter. I don't know what he used. It could have been a spear or something. But anyway, I didn't find one that I thought I wanted to share with you. Anyway, that's his lineage. So he comes from Cush, the son of Ham. Notice then his fame as a mighty warrior. And Genesis 10:8b, he began to be a mighty one in the earth. This would be among the peoples of the world. A mighty one is the Hebrew Gibor. And this is a word, even Jesus Christ is referred to in the Old Testament as El Gibor, as God, the heroic God, the great warrior God. This is, I always think of that when I read in Paul writing to the Corinthians that Christ continues to reign until he puts the last enemy under for God. So he's the warrior God, you know. So it's not always a bad thing, but a great warrior. And in fact, David's warriors, the mighty men of valor, they were valorous. They were valor rather than vice, but they were Gibor. They were mighty men. So that's the word. He was a mighty warrior, a man that could handle his weapons and defeat enemies. Then his fame as a hunter, in verse 9, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. This word before carries the picture of before the face of God. And looking at this, it's often just used to mean before. So the idea that he's doing this in the face of God, I don't see this as necessary in the language. It could be, and it seems to be, that he was not a dynamic Christian person. Nothing about his walk with God, nothing about his agreement with God, nothing about his carrying on of worthwhile things. He's an empire builder, but he's a mighty hunter. So this makes me think that probably that's how he rose to prominence. I'm guessing, as everybody else was guessing. Noah and his sons left the mountains of Ararat and evidently moved south. We find everything, all the history seems to be south of that. They came into the areas of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. If you go directly south, and I don't know geographically even if that's possible from the mountains of Ararat, you would come to about the middle of Mesopotamia or even a little northwest in that area. So I don't know where they landed and which way they went, but at any rate, they were moving out. They were finding land, claiming it for their tribe, their family, building it up, clearing the vegetation, planting fields, whatever they were doing. And what happens as you do this, as you move into new territories, there are places where animals have established, in the period of time that we imagine going on, animals would have settled there. And it may be, maybe some of the bigger animals, some of the dinosaur type animals, big, powerful animals that hadn't been killed off by the new kind of environment, the new weather construct, were there and became problems for the people. And it took dynamically warrior people to come and defend them against that, kill the enemy, to slay the dragons. And that may be the situation. Maybe, so he was maybe as a defender, that kind of a warrior of the people. It could be that since it takes a lot of people farming a lot of land to feed a lot of people, it takes acres before all the modern conveniences and refrigeration and fertilizer, all these things have been developed, machinery. It took several acres per person, or an acre a person, or something like this to provide food during the growing season to last through the year. So it may be that many people were settled, became farmers, and supplied the families with fruits and vegetables. Perhaps at that time others specialized in providing meat for the groups. You had to go visit Nimrod butcher shop, he would go find the animals, kill them, have them ready, sell them to the people. I don't know. However, we find that immediately he's talked about as a city founder, builder, conqueror. So his building or conquering of cities seems to imply that his hunting was for more than dangerous animals. He was a person to be dealt with. Let me take you then to his fame as empire builder, and I'll show you a map that I found. You see in the red words, Nimrod's kingdom, and it's to the north and the south of it there, and it's hard to show, but the waving line that you see, the blue line, that's Euphrates. You might be able to read that. And then next to it is the Tigris, which is a little straighter river, but between the rivers is Mesopotamia. Clear at the bottom right, sort of just off the R of Sumer. Can you see the word Sumer, S-U-M-E-R? Like the little mark for the R is pointing to the city of Ur. And that's where Abraham came from. That's just south of the Euphrates River there. Well, then from there on up, clear to Nineveh, and Nineveh is just to the left of the word Assyria. You see the A of Assyria, and just to the left of that, there's a dot, and there's an N word there. I don't know if you can read that, but Nineveh. So that's the extent. I mean, that's all of Mesopotamia. That's the whole area. And so we're going to be looking at this. He says the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. And we see in the word Babylonia, and then a red word right to the right of the L in Babylonia. The red word is Babylon. And that red dot is where he began. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Then he branched off to Erech. Erech is listed here down by Ur and just to the upper right of the R of Sumer. That's Erech. Akkad, Acadia, you see the golden letters there are Akkad, and Kalna, and this is not Kaleb, but Kalna, and I think I saw it there, but anyway, in the land of Shinar. And Shinar is a plain, a level area. Not a valley, but the plain between the rivers. Out of that land went forth Ashur, or to say, out of that land, out of this area more toward the south, I'm pointing to the map I can see, to the south, he went out into Assyria, and Assyria goes clear up to that word Assyria, and builded Nineveh, the city of Rehoboth, or Nineveh and the streets of the city. And then Kala. And Kala, where it says the land of Shinar, the L capital L of land, is pointing right to Kalna. You see it in parenthesis. Above Kalna is the word Nimrod, Nimrud, and that's its other name. And in history, that was what it was called. So clearly looking back to Nimrod as the thing. And then from there also Kala, which I mentioned, then Reason, and that's not on the map. I don't think they've found that, and that's between Nineveh and Kala. And he says Reason is the same as a great city. So a great city. Wherever he went, he was building great cities. I don't know if you know, captains of business, if you know empire builders, if you know the type of guy who does this, who builds a city, founds a great city of Babel, and is not satisfied, but just moves on, builds another city, and another, and takes over another city. I don't think you can, like a church planter tries to move from one place to another and build another church and found another church. It seems to me that he was gathering people and claiming them, organizing them, saying, let's have an organization of cities. He was building a one world government. Now, God had set it up for government with Noah after the flood. This is when he said that whosoever sheddeth man's blood as a murderer, by man shall his blood be shed, and you can't have the one shedding his blood be a murderer. So the thing is, this was the organization of man. Mankind would make a judgment to kill the murderer. That's the initiation of capital punishment, which was God's idea. Based on the fact that man was made in the image of God, and therefore you as an individual don't have the right to choose when to end a person's life. That's not your call. You may defend yourself, all of that, but even then, to plot that, to plan it, that's not up to you. Now, I should say here that Babel, of course, his beginning place, that is the site of the great tower, the Tower of Babel. Now, many of these names are named for what they would become, because Babel itself means confusion, and it was named for the aftermath of the Tower of Babel, what God did there. So it wasn't called Babel when he founded it. Let's just call this place confusion. That wasn't what he was doing. So that's where it began. So Nimrod began his kingdom there, and I don't know whether he founded that or just maybe he was the head of the tribe. He was a mighty warrior. Very often the guy who could protect everybody became the head of it. Often, our whole concept of a nation in the ancient times was a family. You have a tribal head. The eldest of that was, that's why kin, your kinfolk, your kin, and your king are related terms. The king was the eldest kin and the man. And in some of them, it was more martial law type of thing, and a person who was the greatest protector became the leader. But at any rate, this is we don't find nations like the United States in ancient times. You didn't have a mixing and a mingling, but you did have one nation conquering another tribe, and therefore mingling with it and it becoming your tribe, as it were. So he then went from there, moving to other areas. He went over 100 miles southeast to found Erech, then northwest to found Akkad. When these were established, he went way northwest to the land that would become Assyria and established Nineveh. As he returned southeast, he founded Kala and then Reason in between the two. So once he had got his authority over this, I want you to recognize this would be a pretty great kingdom even today. To have one man in control of all this, This is a mighty warrior. Now, nothing in this implies that he was really a bad guy, but if you're accomplishing all of this, if you're subduing other areas, I don't know if he was just ought to be an inspirational builder of things, or a guy that just conquered. If history of tradition means anything, he was a conqueror of men, a hunter of men, and this before the Lord. I think it means as God would see all the people of the earth, he was the most mighty hunter. There might be an implication there that he was doing it in the face of God. Didn't care what God said, but nothing that is described in what he's doing seems to be particularly anti-God, against all of the legends and the mythology. Well, let's move out of chapter 10 and go to chapter 11, because there we find the Tower of Babel. Tower of Babel. We find the time of the tower, and I have to make some assumptions here, but if we assume that the division in Peleg's day meant the confusion of the general language, then the time of the tower was right at 100 years after the flood ended. And I'll take you through my thinking here. Genesis 10:25, unto Eber, I believe he, and others agree with me, I believe that Eber was the ancestor. If you plot out their lifespans, he lived, if you think of the tribe named for the oldest male, it would have been the tribe of Eber through several generations. He outlived many of his descendants. And so I think the word Hebrew came from this. Abraham is called a Hebrew, and I think it means of the line of Eber, at any rate. Unto Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, and the King James margin says that is the word for division. For, why was he named that? For in his days was the earth divided. Now, it doesn't demand that this is the confusion of the language, but when we read about the confusion of the language, we find that that's what divided the people. That's what spread them, scattered them around the earth. So I think this is what it was, that it was in Peleg's day. His brother's name was Joktan. Now, if we assume that to be true, Genesis 11:10, these are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. All right, Kyle and Delich argue here that after the flood means after the flood began. If that's so, and it seems reasonable, this would be 1 year after the flood ended. The flood basically about a year. And so 2 years after that would mean 1 year after the flood ended. Then we read, so that's 1 year after the flood, when Arphaxad was born. Genesis 11:12, 14, and 16. Arphaxad lived 35 years, so we add 35 years to the one, and begat Salah. Then verse 14, Salah lived 30 years, so we add 30 years to the number, and begat Eber. And Eber lived 34 years and begat Peleg. So if in Peleg the division happened, the language was confused, then we have 1 plus 35 plus 30 plus 34, it equals 100 years. So if my thinking is correct, if my assumptions are correct, then that was when the Tower of Babel and the confusion of the language occurred. That's not very long, in historical terms. They have come from the ark. They have begun to spread out. They've begun to, and people living hundreds of years, having sons and daughters. The common phrase in all of this is, so the population was building and building, and people are spreading out and finding more room and getting crowded and having an argument with the neighbor, and so moving on to another area. Plenty of land, the whole earth. But they can't live everywhere. You can't live on a barren rock and all that. So they have to move to a place where they can farm, and the more people, the more land you need, all of that. We are given the conditions of the tower in chapter 11, verses 1 through 4. Read this with me. The whole earth was of one language, literally one lip, and of one speech, literally of one words, one set of vocabulary. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east, and this, ironically, as you wouldn't think, could mean or eastward. So from the east means going west, eastward means going east. And as I mentioned, if you come south from the mountains of Ararat, you're sort of in the middle of that Mesopotamia area. So it could be either way. But as they went there, they found the plain in the land of Shinar. That's the flat area between the rivers. And they dwelt there. Good, fertile area, later to be called the Fertile Crescent, as they could move from Babylon through that area on down into the Promised Land and on over into Egypt. And they said one to another, literally a man said to his neighbor, "Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly." Burn them to a burning. And they had brick for stone, instead of stone is the idea, and slime they had for mortar. You say, there seemed to be an abundance of slime there. Well, it ends up that the slime they're talking about probably, and geographically and archaeologically, is asphalt, is a tar. They have the tar pits there, several of them. And they used that for mortar. They said, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven." This doesn't have to mean where God lives, it can just mean the sky. That would be a skyscraper, as we say today. And let us make us a name, a reputation, you see, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Now, in this, and I had to ask myself in this, what was wrong with this? Why did God confound the language to stop this? It's a pretty interesting question. You know, they're building a building. They want to establish an area. So this happens at Babel. Nimrod founded it and is in control of the entire area. So he's behind this. So I'm thinking, why? It says the people did this, but the people were led by Nimrod here. So Nimrod was settling the whole valley of Mesopotamia. The people found the clay soil and the asphalt pits of the area provided excellent building blocks and mortar. Elsewhere, they would find stone, cut it, and use it. Here they didn't have that much stone, but they could heat the clay into a kiln, a furnace, and make it as hard as stone. Elsewhere we find that they would sun dry the clay, and it would work pretty well, but to burn it thoroughly, to heat it thoroughly, gave it a stronger make it stone-like. Archaeology has found many examples of buildings made of kiln-fired brick and asphalt in ancient Babylon. So it was the standard thing. It was the way they did it, and probably even back at that time. Genesis 11:4, they said, "Go to, let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. Let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the earth." Nimrod would have seen the value. It's always a problem. Travel is a problem. Controlling the entire length of the Mesopotamia would be a difficult problem. You have to have your vice presidents, your vice kings, all these things. You have to have You have it all set up. You have to have leadership. You have to have people that are desperately loyal to you, all scattered through. And you have to have runners. You have to have writers. You have to have people that are communicating. So he would have seen the value of a tall central structure to tie his kingdom together. I suppose on a clear day you could see the Tower of Babel from far, far, far away. We lived in Denver for a while. On a clear day you could see, what's the big mountain at the Pikes Peak. You could see Pikes Peak, and it was 150 miles? Yeah, anyway, a long way away. Now you wouldn't be able to see it from the north to the south of Mesopotamia, but nonetheless, think how impressive that would look. A structure whose top reached the sky would attract others to his kingdom, make its name famous. I think he would be happy with this concept. Now, God seems to have a different purpose for the rest of the planet. They said, let's establish it. We don't want to be scattered. We'll be here. We'll grow. We'll prosper. Everything will be under Nimrod. He did not want the world's population centered in Mesopotamia. So we'll think of why. All right, the condemnation of the tower we find in Genesis 11:5 and 6. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower. God didn't have to come down and walk among men to see this. Of course, he knows it all. But this is a way of saying it that says that God took a particular perception of this, looked at this particularly, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, behold, the people is one. They have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Again, it doesn't say what was wrong with this. But I think I found the reasoning behind this, God's reasoning, when much later Paul is speaking in Athens for his defense at the Mars Hill. Acts 17:26 and 27. He tells them this, and God hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed, the time of the raising of kingdoms, and the bounds of their habitation, where they would live, separating the nations. Why? That they should seek the Lord, if haply they may feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. You know, the lesson in this is that the answer is not always unity. The big thing as I was growing up, the ecumenical movement, you know, the idea of all the churches together. But Jesus said he wanted the church to be one as he and the Father are one. Well, he wanted a spiritual unity. It doesn't mean that he wanted an organizational unity. And in fact, very often it's the unity that actually speaks of compromise. So I'm thinking through, and there are two histories that I'd like to run by your thinking that probably indicates why God saw, oh yeah, and here's one of the few photographs of the Tower of Babel. Imagine what it must have been like. That's you see the clouds drifting along the top. So it went to the sky, you see. So I didn't take time to count all those stories there. So maybe you could do that while I'm talking. But we'll move on to the two histories I want you to think of. One is the history of Babel. What was happening there in embryo was to develop by those who stayed. Those whose language were the same stayed in that area. Listen to Revelation 17:5. Upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots or fornications and abominations of the earth. This idea of the mother, at the time of Revelation 17, this Babylon is the one world church, the church that is ruling the world until the 10 kings get together and blow her off the face of the earth. But it's settled, the capital of this one world church is in Babylon, the city of Babylon. And here, it doesn't just talk about what it is now at this time, but also that it was the mother of harlots, talking about a spiritual fornication. This is idolatry. This is giving the worship to that other than the one who deserves the worship, and that is the true and living God. So we recognize, and all through this, we find at the time of the Babylonian captivity, Daniel, great Hebrew name, is given the name Belteshazzar, and Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, beautiful Hebrew names given. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, these guttural Babylonish names, all named for gods, the gods of Babylon. So idol worship. Those who stayed together in Mesopotamia after the division filled the cities. Historians and archaeologists chronicle their religious ways from those ancient times. They emblazoned the tops of their towers because they built these ziggurats, and they decorated the tops of them with their gods based on the stars. They had the Babylonian zodiac at the time. They developed these things. They were fascinated with the stars. And the progression of the corruption of sin that Paul described in Romans 1 is evident in their works, because very clearly they were not worshiping a transcendent God, but they thought of him and represented him as in the form of a human, and then of animals and of birds and creeping things and so on. It's all right there in the history of what they did and how they believed. So if that reflects back to what was beginning there, then God said this is not going to be a healthy environment. God often, or the time that God judges and changes things is when it's bad for the people, bad for his people. So I think that would have been bad because it corrupted the very heart of the truth. But then secondly, the history of emperors. Dictators, absolute monarchs are notorious for their cruelty, their violence to establish their will and way. God's judgments are usually based on people's violence to one another, as was the flood itself. So often dictators control the religion of the people to keep their focus on subservience to the dictator. So if you think about what Babylon would be and what it would contribute to the false religion of the world, and what an eminent domination that Nimrod had for all of Mesopotamia, if you think about that, you recognize this was not a good situation, and this is why God said this has to stop. We find then finally the confusion of the language. Genesis 11, 7-9. Go to, God says, let us go down. God speaking within the Trinity, I think, and there confound their language. This is something only God would think of, This is something that is possible for him to do. It's not possible for us to do this. It's just an amazing concept. That they may not understand one another's speech. This is a changing of something in the brain, isn't it? This is, they still could speak, they still could form words and all this kind of stuff, but now all the words were different. The construction of the language was different. It was just changed the language, the way they thought about it. What an amazing concept. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth. And they left off to build the city. They just stopped. That picture of the completed Tower of Babel probably doesn't look like that. Maybe halfway there. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, that is confusion, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. I found that later on they claimed the name Babel, but they took it from the Semitic language Babel, the gate of God. But that's not the original meaning. That was a euphemism. It was the word for confusion. Because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. Trying to think of this. They're all gathered working, and probably not all of them wanted to be doing this work, but it takes a great deal of work to put all this together. And suddenly the one guy starts speaking, Chinese language, and another guy some other thing, and nobody understands. And this is terrifying. If you suddenly can't understand anything anybody's saying, you think you're going crazy, right? Or they are. They turned into a madman, run. So my thinking here is this, that the root families of the languages of earth today began at this event. Those who study languages find that one develops from another, and you can trace all the different languages down to where these two are a branch off this, and then finally these two and then these two branched off. But when you get down to the bottom, at the Tower of Babel, there were perhaps 70 different families. I think God would keep the same language within the immediate families. But evidently immediate families kept the same language, but others spoke in a way that communication and understanding was lost. So now organization was gone. But I can see why it would stop the building of the city. Why did they flee, run for your lives, run for the hills? Why did they go around the world? And so my thinking is this, that perhaps anger and suspicion, more than mere differences in language, seems implied by the fact that they scattered upon the face of the earth. I don't know. But I do imagine this because this was magical, this was strange, this was supernatural. This is not the normal way. They had this picture at the Ark encounter, and this is, you can see in the mist behind the base of the tower, the ziggurat there, in the form of the ancient ziggurats found in the area of Babylon. And the people are just packed up and leaving. They're getting out of there. I imagine that some things were going on. The dominant religions, perhaps, were doing things that seemed ugly and creepy and shady. And then all this happens. And they said, I knew this was wrong. I just knew this was wrong. Let's get out of here. And if they had been inscripted to do the work, organization ended right then that day. And suddenly, so they would have gone home, packed, and left for home, built something nice like a lighthouse, not a Tower of Babel. Quite a story, huh? And so you can trace the division of the languages back to here, and that the different languages were actually made by God. Well, here we find it's not specifically mentioned to us that they are overtly doing horrible things, but it just wasn't the plan of God. It just wasn't the way He wanted it to develop. And you think of the power, the coercive power that it would have meant to control all of these people all through Mesopotamia. It sounds like some pretty tough times, harsh policing. And I think God wanted that broken up. So for whatever reason, this is what happened. And an important part of our history of the world, of the United States. As we were talking about the day of Pentecost, when the church began, it's kind of the final consummation of this, where all the languages were gathered together, that there was a unity that was asked for by all of these languages praising God for his wonderful works. So an interesting connection of the two messages, the Sunday school and this message. Well, let's go have our fellowship dinner. We'll have a good meal, and then we'll talk about the beginning of Abraham, the beginning of Abram's walk with God, and where he came from and all that. It's also another interesting bit of history that I think takes some working to work it all out. Let's stand together. We'll pray. Father, we thank you for this lesson that tells us that the answer to everything is not an organizational unity that demands everyone doing the same thing or the same kind of thing or believing the same kind of thing as everybody else. For you have given us the truth, and we are to be fully persuaded in our own minds of what that truth exactly is and how we should obey it. I ask, Father, that you might so work in us that we would become sensitive not only to the blatant do's and don'ts of your word, but to evaluate the excellence, to be discerning in what is not just right or wrong, but what is the best thing we can do? How can we best serve thee and others? And that becomes our goal. If our quest is indeed for excellence, then we are not caught in the average, the mundane, the mediocre. We're not wasting our lives just for the laziness of self, but rather we want to continue to grow. We want to continue to learn from thee. We want to be those people who serve thee with a full and complete heart. With your heads bowed, eyes closed, perhaps you would like me to pray for you concerning the idea that before your life, there are decisions that you can make to perhaps increase wealth and power and finances and be like Nimrod, be considered a mighty warrior in the earth. But maybe what the real need is that you should come to be a mighty person with the Lord and give that to him. If that's your prayer, I wonder if you'd slip your hand up. Say, help me to correct my attitude about the purposes of life. Father, then we thank you for an opportunity to consider our lives compared to this one who received for a relatively short time the renown of being a mighty emperor. But in one day, with one act of your miraculous work, it was all undone, and the people fled and left, went around the world establishing their own nations. Now I ask, Father, that you might guide and direct each one of us and help us to make the decision for not only what is right and against what is wrong, but to determine for ourselves what is best, according to your word. We pray thy blessing in Jesus' name. Amen.